Roy Benavidez's life didn't open with a childhood. It opened with a funeral. Born August 5th, 1935 in Cuero, Texas, his first real memory was watching his father lowered into the ground after tuberculosis finished him off. Roy was only 3. A year later, his mother remarried. 9 months after that came a new baby sister. From then on, Roy and his younger brother Rogelio were little more than baggage. The stepfather had his own priorities, and the boys weren't on the list. Then tuberculosis struck again. Roy's mother developed the same cough that had killed her husband. As she lay dying, the man who had replaced him made no secret of his indifference. Roy, just 6 years old, already knew what was coming. No parents and no one willing to raise him. At his mother's funeral, an uncle stepped in and claimed the boys. They were driven away from the gravesite to El Campo, Texas, where they joined a household that was already bursting at the seams. Cousins, grandparents, and rules forged out of poverty. 10 children under one roof meant 2 things. Everyone worked, and nobody got much attention. By age 7, Roy was shining shoes. Summers were for the fields, cotton, beets, whatever paid. His small hands blistered and toughened before most kids even had calluses. There was no allowance, no pocket money. Everything earned went into keeping the household afloat. Childhood meant labor. It also meant anger. Losing both parents and being cast aside left Roy hard. He was smaller than most kids, but he learned to make up for it with his fists. Insults were answered the only way he knew how. By the time he was 10, he had a reputation for being quick to fight and quick to win. He also developed a fascination that had nothing to do with school. When he could scrape together a few cents, he'd head for the movie theater. The films didn't matter, the newsreels did. They showed World War II in motion. Paratroopers dropping from the sky, tanks rolling across Europe, the kind of battles no textbook could make real. Roy watched and decided that was his future. He would jump out of planes in uniform and fight like the men on the screen. But outside the theater doors, he was reminded daily that Texas in the 1940s didn't think of kids like him as American. Classmates hurled slurs, dismissed him as a migrant, and made sure he knew where they thought he stood. He fought them too, with the same stubbornness he showed in the fields. He didn't see himself as less American than anyone else, and he wasn't going to let anyone tell him otherwise. By 14, classrooms felt pointless. He left school and took a full-time job at a tire shop. The wages helped the family, and the grind hardened him even further. A worried relative pushed him into amateur boxing, hoping to channel the aggression. Roy was tough enough to climb fast, but he was also hot-headed. One loss ended in a scuffle outside the ring that left him ashamed of himself. The first time he realized that strength without control wasn't strength at all. From then on, he worked, boxed, and tried to keep the temper in check. The shop owner became the closest thing to a father figure he'd had since his own died, drilling into him the value of discipline. But in the back of Roy's mind, nothing changed. He still carried the picture from the newsreels: boots, parachutes, combat. The dream was waiting. By the time Roy reached his late teens, he had learned 2 things: how to outwork just about anyone and how to take a punch. But what he really wanted wasn't another paycheck from a tire shop or another amateur boxing match. What he wanted was the uniform, the boots, the wings. To be the man dropping out of an airplane like the ones he'd watched in the newsreels. The Texas National Guard gave him his first step towards it. On weekends and during summers, he drilled, marched, and carried a rifle. For Roy, it wasn't a side job. It was proof that he could claw his way into the Army on determination alone. But guard duty was part-time, and the itch didn't go away. He wanted full-time. So he walked into an active duty recruiter's office with one simple request: the Army, regular service, and a guaranteed contract for airborne school. What he got instead was a master class in recruiter fine print. The paperwork shuffled, the promises sounded right, and then he found himself right back at basic training like none of his guard service had counted. And when he finished, no jump wings, no airborne school, just a standard assignment in the needs of the Army file. His first stop was Korea. The war had ended in an armistice, but the demilitarized zone was still one of the most dangerous places in the world. American patrols faced hostile eyes and itchy trigger fingers every day. Roy learned discipline and endurance there, but not the thing he wanted most, the parachute jump. From Korea, he went to Germany. The Cold War was simmering, and American soldiers were scattered across Europe as both reassurance and early warning. Roy fit in, picked up some German, and liked to joke later that he spoke it with a heavy Texas accent. He worked hard, stayed sharp, and kept waiting for his break. Instead of wings, he got orders to military police school. He spent months as a uniformed chauffeur, driving colonels and generals, guarding posts, and saluting people who barely noticed him. For a man who had dreamed of dropping into battle, opening car doors was its own kind of punishment. At that point, he considered getting out. The Army had promised one thing and delivered another. The boy who had dreamed of being a paratrooper was now a driver with a clean uniform and no combat to show for it. According to some accounts, this was when fate intervened. While working as a driver, he supposedly caught the attention of General William Westmoreland. The story goes that Westmoreland asked if Roy had ever considered airborne school. Roy explained that it was the only reason he had joined in the first place, but the opportunity had slipped through his fingers. Whether Westmoreland remembered the conversation or not, when Roy's next re-enlistment papers came across his desk, they included a slot for airborne training. Official records don't spell out how it happened. What mattered was that Roy finally had his shot. Airborne school at Fort Benning was brutal, but it was everything Roy wanted. The training stripped away the weak and the half-hearted, and when it was over, Roy had his silver wings. After years of waiting, after Korea, Germany, and military police duty, he was finally a paratrooper. With his badge came assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, the All-Americans, one of the Army's most storied units. Here Roy lived the life he had dreamed of, jump training, endless drills, and the pride of being part of a division that prided itself on being first in and last out. Off duty, life finally seemed steady. He met Lala, courted her properly, and married her. Before long, they had their first child. For a man who had lost his parents before he even understood the word family, this was everything he had ever wanted. A wife, a child, a home, and the badge of an airborne soldier on his chest. But peace doesn't last in uniform. In 1965, the Army shipped him to South Vietnam. Officially, his role was advisor, training South Vietnamese troops to stand on their own. In practice, it meant leading patrols through the jungle, fighting side by side with men who weren't ready to do it alone. Roy was 30 years old, fit, experienced, and exactly the kind of soldier the Army wanted in the field. One patrol changed everything. Somewhere in the green hell of Vietnam, Roy stepped on a landmine. The blast didn't kill him outright, but it smashed him into the ground and broke him to pieces. When he came to, he wasn't in the jungle anymore. He was in a hospital bed in the Philippines, then San Antonio, staring at doctors and nurses who were telling him his military career was over. His back was broken. His head had taken catastrophic trauma. He might not ever walk again. The Army began paperwork to discharge him as permanently disabled. The paratrooper wings pinned to his chest were now just decoration. The life he had fought for, the only thing he had wanted since childhood, had ended in the space of a single explosion. At least that's what everyone else thought. Roy wasn't ready to believe it. The landmine didn't kill Roy Benavidez, but it might as well have. By the time he regained awareness, he was thousands of miles from Vietnam, laying flat in a military hospital bed. His back was fractured, his skull had been rattled so badly that for weeks he didn't even recognize his own wife, and the doctors were unanimous. He would never walk again. To the Army, that meant his career was finished. The paperwork for medical discharge started almost immediately. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. A 30-year-old paratrooper had fought for years to earn his wings, only to lose everything to a defective landmine. For Roy, the verdict didn't sit. He wasn't naive. He could feel the damage in his body. His legs were dead weight, his balance gone, his strength leaking away by the day. But being told you can't had always been the spark that drove him forward, and he wasn't ready to give up on himself. Rehab, as far as the Army was concerned, wasn't about restoring him to combat. It was about preparing him to live as an invalid. They had him doing shape sorter toys like a child, testing motor functions, convincing him to accept his new role in life. By day, therapists trained him for the chair. By night, Roy made other plans. As soon as the ward quieted down, he'd throw himself out of bed and drag his body across the floor. He clawed his way to a nightstand or bed frame, hauled himself upright, and forced his ruined legs to bear weight. The pain was excruciating. Sometimes he'd collapse. Sometimes nurses caught him and sedated him to stop the self-destruction. But every night he tried again. Every night he pushed his muscles a little further. The other patients noticed. Men with their own injuries watched him sweat and collapse and get back up. They distracted nurses to buy him time. They cheered him quietly when he stood, even for a second, on legs the doctors swore were finished. Weeks became months. His hips ached from falling. His legs burned from exertion, but slowly, impossibly, he gained strength. He could balance for seconds, then minutes. He could take a step, then another. One day when the doctor came in with discharge papers to sign him out of the Army for good, Roy stood up in front of him. He walked across the room, shaking, drenched in sweat, but upright. The disbelief on the doctor's face told him everything. He had done the impossible. From that day, Roy wasn't just walking, he was training. The hospital eventually released him, not because they thought he was ready for combat, but because he refused to stop proving them wrong. At Fort Bragg, he pushed himself harder. At first it was walking a mile, then 5, then running 5, then 10. Push-ups, hundreds of them, every day. Pull-ups until his arms burned. He wasn't just reclaiming his life, he was building himself back into a soldier. Within a year, he was stronger than many men who had never been injured. He even managed to slip back onto jump manifests at Bragg, making 3 parachute jumps in a single day. It was reckless, insane even, but it proved the point. Roy Benavidez wasn't just walking, he was airborne again. Most men would have stopped there, satisfied with beating the odds. Roy wasn't most men. Having forced himself back from a broken back and near permanent disability, he set his sights even higher. He applied for Special Forces. Selection was its own brand of misery. Long marches, endless runs, navigation courses that punished mistakes with miles of backtracking, and instructors who wanted to see who would quit. Roy didn't quit. He passed the physical tests, the psychological tests, the endurance trials, and came out the other side with a Green Beret. Then came the training pipeline, languages so he could operate in any theater, weapons so he could fire, fix, and teach almost anything on a battlefield, medical training so he could patch wounds in the middle of combat, intelligence so he could gather and process information in the field. Each course was another mountain, and Roy climbed all of them. By the mid-1960s, the same man who had once been told he'd never stand again was now one of the Army's most versatile soldiers, a Green Beret trained to heal, to teach, to fight, and to survive. He had gone from broken and discarded to elite, from almost a casualty to one of the few men trusted to go where the United States officially couldn't. His fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. By the time Roy Benavidez finished the grueling pipeline and put on his Green Beret, he was a man remade. A year earlier, he'd been told to accept a wheelchair. Now he was a linguist, a medic, a weapons expert, and an intelligence gatherer. But the Army had one more card to play. His assignment wasn't a normal Special Forces group. It was to MACV-SOG, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. That bland title was deliberate camouflage. On paper, it sounded like desk work. In reality, it was the most secretive and dangerous special operations unit America had in Vietnam. MACV-SOG was the shadow war. They operated where the United States officially wasn't, in Laos, Cambodia, and across the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While politicians in Washington swore America was respecting borders, men like Roy were slipping across them, tracking enemy supply lines, planting explosives, and ambushing convoys. It was work that didn't make headlines. It didn't even make unit rosters. The missions were deniable, the casualty rates obscene. One statistic floated among operators. If you served with SOG for any length of time, you had a 100% chance of being wounded. A Purple Heart wasn't a medal, it was a rite of passage. Roy adapted quickly. He was part of the tiny American Hatchet Force, embedded with larger teams of South Vietnamese and Montagnard fighters. They shadowed the North Vietnamese army through jungle that swallowed entire companies. They learned the trails, the caches, the habits of a ghost enemy. Sometimes they fought, more often they ran. Small teams couldn't stand toe-to-toe against battalions, so survival meant speed, cunning, and the occasional brutal ambush. The danger was constant. On one mission, a wounded teammate had to be hauled out of the jungle dangling beneath a helicopter on what was called a McGuire rig, essentially a rope hoist. Roy and the casualty clipped in, only for their ropes to tangle in midair. Nylon against nylon meant friction. Friction meant heat, and heat meant the ropes could snap at any second. Another teammate risked his own life by lowering himself down on a third rope to untangle them. It worked, but the lesson was clear. In SOG, every day was a dice roll with death. For Roy, it was exactly the kind of test he had been remade for. He was back in combat, back where the stakes were highest, doing the job no one else wanted because it was too dangerous. The jungle shadow war carried on like this for months. Small teams hunted and were hunted in turn. Helicopters faked insertions to confuse the enemy. Saboteurs slipped defective ammunition into enemy stockpiles so rifles and mortars would explode in their users' hands. All the while, SOG teams lived on borrowed time. Roy knew it couldn't last forever. One day the enemy would catch them in force. One day the odds would run out. And when that day came, he'd have to decide whether to run or to stand. That day was coming faster than anyone knew. On May 2, 1968, a radio call came in that changed everything. A 12-man MACV-SOG team had been ambushed deep inside Cambodia. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and taking fire from hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers. The code words coming across the net made it clear. This was more than trouble. It was catastrophe. Helicopters scrambled to respond. They returned shot full of holes, door gunners bleeding, pilots shaken. The men on the ground were still pinned, and the helicopters couldn't land to reach them. The most they could do was drop ammunition into the trees and hope someone down there could still fight. Roy Benavidez was at base when the news hit. He had only just survived one brush with death, the landmine, and rebuilt himself into a Green Beret. Now, one of the men trapped out there was his friend, Sergeant Leroy Wright, the same man who had once saved Roy during a rope extraction. Roy didn't hesitate. He grabbed his medical bag, sprinted to the landing pad, and climbed aboard one of the helicopters heading back into the fire. In his rush, he made a mistake that would have killed anyone else. He forgot his rifle. When the helicopter lifted off, Roy had no weapon, no food, no water, no radio, no helmet, just an aid bag and a 9-inch knife. The helicopter could only get within 100 yards of the firefight before the enemy fire was too heavy. Roy jumped anyway. The moment his boots hit the ground, he ran through the jungle towards the gunfire and was promptly shot in the leg. He staggered, told himself it was just a thorn or a stumble, and kept running. 50 yards later, a bullet grazed his head, knocking his helmet off and leaving his scalp bleeding. Again, he pressed forward. When he reached the team, the situation was worse than he'd imagined. Men were scattered, wounded, isolated. Ammunition was running low. The enemy was tightening the noose. Roy grabbed a fallen AK-47 from a dead NVA soldier and went to work. He moved from man to man, dragging the wounded into a defensible cluster around a termite mound that became their strong point. He patched wounds, gave morphine, shoved magazine into empty hands, and told half-blind men to fire towards the tree line. He pulled classified maps and radios off the dead and stuffed them in his rucksack so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. As helicopters circled, Roy popped smoke grenades to mark the position and directed door gunners to lay suppressive fire. He loaded the most seriously wounded onto the first extraction bird, then turned back into the jungle because others were still missing. He ran alongside a helicopter, both of them firing into the trees as he reached another survivor and dragged him back. Somewhere in the chaos, he learned that Leroy had been hit. Worse, Leroy was carrying sensitive documents, information too valuable to be left behind. Roy pushed into the tree line alone, gunfire snapping past, until he found his friend's body. He stripped the maps and codes, hoisted Leroy onto his shoulders, and tried to drag him out. That's when another bullet tore into Roy's back. He dropped Leroy, realized he couldn't carry him and survive, and staggered towards the landing zone. As he neared it, enemy fire ripped into the cockpit of the helicopter, waiting to take them out. The pilot slumped dead, the machine spun, and it crashed into a fireball. Now there were even more wounded to save. Roy ran to the wreck, dragged survivors clear of the flames, and armed them with captured rifles. Some men were blind, some crawling, some barely conscious, but Roy positioned them into a rough circle and ordered them to keep shooting. He took an enemy bayonet through his arm, then through his stomach. He killed his attacker with his knife, intestines spilling into his hands as he held himself together with one arm and kept fighting with the other. Airstrikes roared overhead. F-4 Phantoms and A-37s dumped bombs so close the concussions knocked men off their feet. Helicopter gunships stitched the tree line with rockets and miniguns. Still, the NVA kept coming, hundreds of them pouring into the kill zone. For 6 hours, the fight raged, and through it all, Roy moved like a man possessed, firing, dragging, patching, shouting, refusing to stop. Finally, near dusk, a last helicopter dared to land. Roy dragged the wounded to it one by one, pushing and shoving them inside. When he turned back, an enemy soldier rushed him, smashing him across the face with a rifle butt that dislocated his jaw. The bayonet came next, punching into Roy's side. He managed to pull his knife and kill the man, then staggered back to the Huey with his guts literally in his hand. He could have climbed aboard. He should have. Instead, he turned away. 2 more Americans were still crawling towards the helicopter, both too wounded to get there on their own. Roy dragged one under his arm while the other hobbled on his knees, using a captured rifle as a crutch. Together they lurched into the Huey. As they did, the door gunners opened fire, laying down the last bursts of cover fire. Other survivors pulled Roy in as the helicopter lifted off. 6 hours of hell, 37 separate wounds, bullets, shrapnel, bayonets, beatings. He had been shot, stabbed, clubbed, and blown apart, and he was still alive. Every man still breathing owed it to Roy. As the helicopter banked towards safety, he finally lost consciousness. When the helicopter finally touched down, Roy Benavidez was barely hanging on to life. He had been shot multiple times, slashed, stabbed, beaten, and blown apart. He had dragged men, carried men, fought men hand to hand, and held his own intestines in his hand to keep them from spilling. Now unconscious and bled nearly dry, he looked like another corpse on the floor of the Huey. The medics thought so too. His body was laid out among the dead, a tangle of uniforms and blood. His skin was dark from heritage and darker still from grime and dried blood. From the perspective of a harried medic, he looked like one more enemy body scooped up in the confusion. Someone started zipping him into a body bag. The teeth of the zipper pulled together at his ankles, climbing past his waist, and closed in on his chest. Roy couldn't open his eyes. They were glued shut with blood. He couldn't speak. His jaw was dislocated and locked. He couldn't move. His muscles were drained to nothing. All he could do was listen as the bag swallowed him alive. The zipper reached his neck. A friend who had fought beside him shouted for the medic to check again. The medic protested. There was nothing left to check, but the friend insisted. The zipper slid back and a hand pressed against Roy's chest, searching for a heartbeat. In that moment, with nothing else left in him, Roy summoned the last spark of willpower he had. He spat. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't dramatic, it was the only movement he could manage. A fleck of blood and saliva landing on the medic's cheek. It was enough. The medic realized the corpse was alive. The body bag was torn open, and Roy Benavidez was rushed into surgery. The doctors didn't expect him to live through the night. Then they didn't expect him to live through the week. But he did. Again and again, he did. When his chain of command pieced together what he had done in Cambodia, they knew it was one of the most extraordinary feats of valor in the war. The problem was bureaucracy. Officially, MACV-SOG didn't exist. Officially, Americans weren't in Cambodia. And if they weren't in Cambodia, then Roy couldn't have fought there. The Army found a workaround. Instead of recommending him for the Medal of Honor, which might take years of paperwork, they rushed through a Distinguished Service Cross. It was the second highest award for valor, and they were desperate to pin it on him while he was still breathing. Roy accepted it, but everyone knew the truth. He deserved the medal. Surviving 37 wounds while saving at least 8 men from certain death was beyond anything the cross was meant to cover. He didn't die. He kept recovering, kept healing, and refused every attempt to push him into medical retirement. Over the next decade, he served quietly, as if the 6-hour war and the spit-in-the-face resurrection had just been another day at work. Meanwhile, others fought for him. Survivors of the mission wrote statements, pushed paperwork, and begged the Pentagon to upgrade his award. Again and again, the answer came back, denied. The problem wasn't Roy, the problem was politics. To admit what he had done meant admitting where he had been. And for years, no one in power wanted to confirm that American Special Forces had been operating across borders the government had sworn to respect. It took over a decade for the wall to crack. By the late 1970s, survivors of that day were telling their stories publicly. One of them, who Roy had assumed dead, came forward and submitted a first-hand account that reignited the process. But even then, the Medal of Honor recommendation was rejected. The only way it finally went through was by scrubbing the truth. Instead of saying Roy fought in Cambodia, the paperwork simply read that his actions occurred to the west of Loc Ninh, the South Vietnamese airfield he had stationed at. How far west was left unstated. That was enough to make it politically palatable. In 1981, 15 years after the 6-hour battle, Roy Benavidez stood in the White House as President Ronald Reagan draped the Medal of Honor around his neck. The room applauded, the cameras flashed, and the story of the Green Beret who had literally spat his way back from the grave finally received the recognition it deserved. Roy never boasted about it. He never claimed to be a hero. He simply lived with the scars, all 37 of them, and carried on as he always had. When the Medal of Honor finally hung around his neck in 1981, Roy Benavidez could have walked away content. He had survived what no man should, and he had finally been recognized for it. But retirement didn't mean peace. He left the Army in 1976 after more than 2 decades in uniform and settled into civilian life in Texas. For once, he had time for his wife Lala and their children. He spoke in schools, at veterans halls, and at civic events, telling a story not to glorify himself, but to remind young people of the cost of freedom. His speeches were simple, heartfelt, and often repeated a theme that he'd learned from his grandfather long before he'd ever put on a uniform. When someone needs help, you help them. In 1983, that lesson was tested again. One morning, Roy opened a letter from the government informing him that his disability benefits were being cut off. Not just his, more than 350,000 veterans were about to lose theirs, casualties of budget trimming and bureaucratic indifference. Roy could have accepted it, lived quietly on his medal and his reputation. Instead, he did what he always did when somebody needed help. He fought. He went public, giving interviews, speaking to the press, and calling out the injustice. He made it clear that if the government was willing to try it on him, a Medal of Honor recipient whose story was known nationwide, then every veteran was at risk. The political pressure worked. Officials backtracked, tried to soften the edges, tried to spin it as misunderstanding. But Roy wasn't satisfied with a cosmetic fix. He took the fight to Congress, testifying before committees, forcing politicians to look him in the eye while he told them exactly what they were doing to the men who had bled for them. The cuts were stopped. The benefits were saved. Hundreds of thousands of veterans who would never know his name still had roofs over their heads and food on the table because Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez refused to be silent. In the years that followed, he became a living legend in military circles. Schools and streets were named for him, books were written about him, and young soldiers learned his story as part of the Green Beret tradition. He never claimed to be special. He called himself lucky, but everyone who heard him knew better. On November 29, 1998, at the age of 63, Roy Benavidez died from complications of diabetes. At his funeral, Green Berets carried him to his grave. Flags flew at half-staff in Texas and across the Army. Men and women who had never met him still felt the weight of his loss. His story was always about more than one man. It was about perseverance when the world tells you you're finished. It was about loyalty when others run. It was about the iron refusal to quit, whether in a rice paddy in Vietnam or in front of a congressional committee. Today, Fort Bragg, the home of the 82nd Airborne, the place where Roy rebuilt himself after the landmine, has been renamed Fort Liberty, a safe, generic name that offends no one and inspires no one. Many argue that if ever there was a soldier who deserved that honor, it was Roy Benavidez. Fort Benavidez, a name that carried sacrifice, endurance, and the very spirit of the Green Berets. Instead, his legacy lives on in stories, in classrooms, in the quiet respect of veterans who know that against impossible odds, one man kept fighting when everyone else would have stopped. Because for Roy Benavidez, the rule never changed. When someone needed help, you helped them, even if it meant giving everything you had, and then spitting back from the grave to prove you weren't done yet. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. Until next time, stand tall.
They left the 3 enemy soldiers on the side, and because I sort of look Oriental, they thought I was one of them, so they let me lay right next to them. And they were putting us in body bags. And I remember that my feet had been lifted, and I was inserted into the body bag, and I could hear that zipper coming up, and I thought, oh my God, no, no. My eyes were shut because I had blood all over my face, and the blood had dried up in my eyelids. And I couldn't talk because my jaws were locked, and I could hear that zipper coming up, and one of my buddies was doing the Mexican head dance, and he was yelling at the doctor, that's Roy Benavidez. The doctor said, sorry, there's nothing I can do for him. Oh my God, and that zipper just coming up. I was trying to wiggle in my own blood, and finally, I'll find out later, Jerry Cottenham made that doctor at least to feel my heartbeat. When I felt that hand on my chest, I made the luckiest shot I ever made in my life. I spit in the doctor's face. So the doctor says, I think he'll make it. So I was cleaned up, put in a helicopter, alongside with my buddy, one of the guys that I had saved. We got airborne, and I just said to myself, hold on, buddy, just hold on. We're going to get some medical attention. And his grip tightened up on me. And then he let go. I said, oh God, why do you put me through this test? Why? You helped me get these men out, save them, save this material, and now you take them away from me. Why? And I was crying, I was moving so much that the co-pilot, he happened to look back, and he thought that I was gasping for air, so he gets out of his seat, get his bayonet out, and he's going to do a track on me, and I'm about to kick him out of the helicopter. That's just too much for one day.